Hello there. I'm Rob Hudson. I'm a member with the law firm Frost Brown Todd, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the NKBA Legends series. This is a new program for the NKBA, and its purpose is to serve the profession by providing information that inspires and guides attorneys in developing ethical, responsible, and effective practice and business development skills. And one of the interesting aspects of the program, I believe, is that sometimes it's difficult to get the most successful people in your life to talk about themselves. There's a modesty factor that goes along with that kind of success. But the legends have agreed to open up and share the secrets to their success, and we're very grateful for that. Now, in the Legends series, we're going to be presenting a series of interviews of individuals who've really made their mark on the community and the profession here in Northern Kentucky. But before we jump in, I wanted to thank Bob McBride at Taft Law, Laura Salzman at Retzel and Andrews, and Julie Jones, our NKBA Executive Director, for their input and involvement in helping to make the series a reality. And during the program today, if you have questions for our interviewee, please present them using the public chat feature in the Zoom function. And at the end of the program, I'll present as many of the questions as we can to the interviewee as time permits. And moving on, introducing our interviewer and interviewee as with the series. This interview really is special to me with a son who's soon entering the legal community in Northern Kentucky, because we're pleased and proud to feature a father-son duo who really elevated our profession here in Northern Kentucky. Our interviewer, Rob Ziegler, is a partner with Ziegler and Schneider, practicing for more than 30 years in Northern Kentucky. He's an outstanding transactional lawyer, and he represents business and governmental interests, serving the public. He's been instrumental in strengthening our NKBA. He served first as president in 2014, and during the difficult times associated with the pandemic, we've again turned to Rob for his leadership. We elected him vice president with our NKBA, and it's wonderful that he agreed to serve the profession again in this way. And he's agreed to interview his father, NKBA legend Will Ziegler, today. A few words about Will. He's the president, senior member of Ziegler and Schneider. He's really devoted his life to serving others. And this started at a young age within our profession. He was named Outstanding Young Man of the Year by Kentucky JCs for civic and charitable contributions. He was an officer and director with Northern Kentucky Industrial Foundation, helped them purchase 1,000 acres of industrial development in Boone and Kenton counties in our Northern Kentucky area. He was elected president of the Northern Kentucky Chamber, served 2 terms as a board member of the Kentucky State Chamber of Commerce, served for 9 years as a board member of the Kentucky Industrial Department Finance Authority. And this is the financing arm of state government for economic development throughout the Commonwealth of Kentucky at the time. He contributed time and energy towards the formation and construction of the Northern Kentucky Convention Center. And for years, he served as its general legal counsel. Served as the first president of Blessed Sacrament School Board, served as chair of the Northern Kentucky Independent District Board of Health. He was a founder at the Bank of Kentucky and later served as its general counsel. He taught law school as an adjunct professor, served as the president of the board for R.C. Durr Foundation. He is a recipient of the NKBA's Distinguished Lawyer Award, among other awards he's received through the years. And it's very clear when you look at this resume and how it touches on business development, health, and charitable endeavors, that Northern Kentucky just wouldn't be where it is today without our legend, Will Ziegler. Rob and Will, thanks for joining us today. And Rob, take it away.
Okay. Rob, thanks for the nice introduction, and we're happy to be the inaugural voyage here on the new Legacy program. So with that, we'll kick it right on in. And first, we're going to touch a little bit on a little bit of your background pre-lawyer. So just wanted to discuss some of your background prior to your law career, in the sense of what were some of your influences and early jobs, those types of things.
Well, before going into that, I would certainly want to mention, I congratulate those, including Rob Hudson, who put together this program. It certainly is unique. When I was invited to be the first speaker, I started trying to figure out, well, what's that about? And not been acquainted with it whatsoever. But and being called legend is a little embarrassing. But I hope, as one of our Bar Association members asked me last week, he had paid $50 to be on this program. He certainly hopes to get his money worth. So I'm going to try my best to fulfill his requirement as he suggested it. Well, the work ethic that my mother imposed on me or pushed me is probably one of the benefits that I first received as a relatively young person. I started to work at age 8 when I was selling produce up and down the street, to caddying, to moving on to multitude of jobs. But the idea that you work, you do your work first, then you play, that was my mother's idea. Her other idea was, well, if you work a boy hard enough, they'll stay out of trouble. So that was the way I began. Other influences, moving on a little bit, were as far as the legal profession is concerned. One time my father needed an attorney to keep us from being evicted from our house. And he turned to his schoolmate, James Quill, who was an attorney at that time, Commonwealth attorney. And I met the attorney for the first time then, and was impressed by him and what he did for us. We didn't get set out on the street, for what that's worth. But beyond that, I asked his advice on, well, I'm going to college ultimately. What kind of courses do I take if I want to be a lawyer? Well, he told me philosophy, history, and English, and I followed his advice. So those were people who influenced me initially. Now, if you want to hear funny stories, for 9 years I spent working in the restaurant industry. Finished my last 3 years at the Hearthstone, which is now the public house in Fort Mitchell, as a bartender. In my earlier years, I was a busboy and a waiter, worked in the kitchen and whatever. But as a young 14-year-old, I was working at the Town and Country, which is now the Gardens of Park Hills, and as a busboy. And we would sit around between lunch and dinner, the employees, the waitresses and all. And eventually, very quickly, the employees said, you ought to be a lawyer. You really got a gift to give. So that was one motivator. Oddly enough, when you're 14, those things mean something. Then for what it's worth, the employees had a petition to request of Mr. and Mrs. Wooten, the then owners, to something they wanted done. They elected me as the spokesman, age 14, to talk. They all sat around the background. I was honored, of course, but later on I learned that they'd picked me because if anybody was going to get fired, it could be me, age 14, and it wouldn't be too much of a loss. So those were early influences that I had. When I went into college, I wanted to be a lawyer, but as I worked through philosophy, and since I had somewhat of an interest in teaching, why I strayed off and majored in philosophy. There were 3 of us in the class. One other was Judge Donald Wintersheimer, well known to you all. We were classmates. And so I was interested in philosophy as well. When I got into my senior year, I had an offer to go to Notre Dame University, a fellowship to study philosophy and eventually become a professor of philosophy. The other I had was a scholarship offer from University of Cincinnati Law School. And I went to see my major professor, Sister Camilla, who, an Irish nun, a CDP nun, who of course had been head of the department. I said, I'm trying to figure out what to do. And her answer, which now surprises me, recognizing that her love was philosophy, she said, "Will, you go to law school, you'll never support yourself teaching philosophy." So there I went to law school. So those were the influences that I can think of come to mind as how I ended up a lawyer. So that's pretty well the background.
Okay, then looking back on your law school career, just share any thoughts regarding that experience, if you would.
Well, a personal experience, as I recognized in the introduction, those are things you're interested in. My scholarship was awarded strictly on merit. There were no need scholarships, and the law school gave out 3 scholarships. The top 3 in the class got the scholarship, and I was one of those in the freshman year. Well, after the freshman year, I finished 4th in the class, a couple of points behind someone else who was 3rd. In that situation, I was expected to lose my scholarship and it would go to someone else. I learned years later, years and years later, that the person who would have received the 3rd place scholarship, a member of one of the prestigious law firms in Cincinnati and coming from a well-educated, well-financed family, said to the dean at that time, "Well, if it means taking the scholarship away from Will Ziegler, I don't want it." As a result of that, I finished 4th in the class for the junior and senior year on my scholarship because someone who became a lawyer for many years gave up the opportunity so that I could get through law school. So that's memories that come to me from law school. And one of the things that is the reason why I'm a lawyer. Whether I could have stayed in school at that time without a scholarship is highly questionable, but I didn't have to, and so here I am. So that's how I came to become a lawyer. Law school interested me. I've often asked, well, what do you think about law school? You've been out 65 years or whatever it is. And at that time, the method of teaching was Socratic. That meant you stood up and you summarized a case out of a book, and then the teacher questioned you intensely until he was sufficiently satisfied he embarrassed you enough. And then that's what most of the classes were. The only practical classes we had at that time were a bit of appellate practice, writing briefs. When I came out to practice law, I learned that all of those things I knew from law school didn't help me a ton to practice law. I had the skills, but not necessarily the wisdom to jump into practice law. I understand now the law schools, and I spoke with some younger lawyers, that now they have some increased courses in law school that are practical in nature and do help the graduate step easier into the practice of law. So that's my thoughts on law school and where it was when I was there and where it might be now.
Okay, and that was law school at Villa Madonna first, is that right?
Well, I went to Villa Madonna College, which is now Thomas More University, and then on to the University of Cincinnati Law School.
Okay.
When I was finished with that, I still had a hanking for teaching somewhat, maybe even teaching law. So I accepted a fellowship to the University of Michigan, where I obtained a doctorate of the science of law, SJD, which sounds like a Jesuit, but that's the particular degree. I did teach part-time 13 years at UC, legal drafting, until I got so busy I couldn't run over there 3 days a week. So that's where I am on law school.
Okay, so starting in your early practice then, what areas did you start in your practice in the early years?
Well, at the time that I was looking for a job, I went throughout Northern Kentucky. I visited the 3 or 4 law firms, of which there were only 3 or 4 in Northern Kentucky, and they consisted of firms of 4 or 5 people. Those were the firms in the area. And one after the other, I was told, well, you know, you certainly got credentials, but we don't need anybody. I visited Charlie Dieter's, I visited the Blakely Moore O'Hara firm, Benton Ludicky and Rhodes in Campbell County. Eventually, I went to see the last hope. I went to see Hughes, Clark, and Lee. That was Gregory Hughes and Andrew Clark, and Mr. Lee was deceased. And I was there in the law firm. And as I was walking out, Mr. Hughes said to me, I don't think we've got anything, but he stuck his head into the office where Andy Clark was. He said, do you think we need somebody? And they made signals back and forth, which I didn't know what they were doing. And finally, he said, well, why don't you give us a call next week? We'll see, maybe we might work out some. The sole reason that I was able to be there and why Mr. Hughes had some sympathy on me, when I was a bartender at the Hearthstone, now Public House, Mr. Hughes and his wife would come in and dine. And Mr. Hughes, of course, was told by his wife he should not drink. Mr. Hughes then always had to go to the bathroom one time while he was there for dinner. He'd come by the bar where I had his one shot of whiskey with a glass of water sitting next to it. And that's how I became acquainted with Mr. Hughes. That's the reason why I ended up at his law firm to ask for a job. And that's why I got there. Now, I didn't even give thought to what kind of work I was going to do. I mean, there wasn't such a thing as looking around, what are you going to do? You're lucky to get a job. So when I arrived the first day, they didn't have any office for me, but I arrived the first day. And after about an hour or two, Frank Burke, long deceased attorney, said, well, come on, let's go. And we walked down to the courthouse where I began to be educated on how you examine titles. And there was John Cleat, who I met, a World War II fighter pilot who had been shot down. He was well decorated. And I spent a good amount of my time in the first couple of years of practice examining titles, closing, transfer real estate, and ultimately wandered over into foreclosing mortgages. The statement was, well, in good times we close loans, in bad times we foreclose mortgages. And from that grew into the business practice. Our firm was primarily a business practice, although most of our lawyers did litigation as well. And that was how I crept into what I became a transactional lawyer, I suppose. My method of payment, I got $50 a week, and I got so many dollars for each title I would do. And then they told me, anything else you get, you just keep. Not figuring I would get very much. So I began, as most lawyers who are on their own starting out, I did collection work and I did eviction work. I even had a reputation one time for having repossessed a baby crib from somebody and satisfied Louis Marx's mortgage. The funny thing on the evictions, I remember, I did a good number of them because at that time there was no district court. Evictions were handled in the Justice of the Peace Court, and you had to have a lawyer to handle evictions at that time. So I had a goodly number of them. One that I did, though, I had to evict a small grocery store run by an elderly lady, and I handled the eviction. But at that time, the moving the people out was a couple of days later done by the constable's office. And as a lawyer, you didn't have much control over when they would do that, but it occurred a few days after the eviction order. I came home that night. My wife said, you got to see this on television. This is terrible. Well, they were showing on Holman Street a long line of groceries lined up on the curb, all sitting along the curb. An elderly lady was standing by there, the lady who owned it, and it was pouring down rain. My wife said, isn't that terrible? Well, I never did tell her that I was the one handling that eviction. So those those are things that I did in my early practice. Ultimately, clients came to me and I no longer had to do evictions and collection work. So that's what I did.
Just in recalling again, your fees for those types of things based on compared to now, do you still have your fee card?
Well, I tell you, when I joined the bar at that time, they gave you a little manual that set forth the amount you should charge for a will, a deed, and whatever. Basically suggested fees, but if a lawyer strayed too much from that, he got a visit from a few other lawyers in the community. Years later, that was deemed to be violation of antitrust practice. So you no longer have a fee schedule that you follow. But we would get $10 for a deed, and we would get maybe $25 for a court appearance. That was what the fees were at that time. On the other hand, you didn't pay much for a quart of milk either. So that was the way it was.
Yep. Okay. Can you describe some of the, in your earlier years, some of the pivotal events that occurred and maybe some also of your early influences, attorney influences in your early career?
Well, the biggest, probably the biggest thing that hit me during my career was I had been with the firm for 7 years, if I get it rightly, 8 years. And my partner was general counsel for the airport. And he was also the rainmaker. That was Andy Clark. Mr. Hughes died a month after I joined the firm. And I got a telephone call at night at my home. It was from the CEO at the airport. And he said to me, "We've had a crash out here at the airport. Andy," that was my partner, "and his wife are both dead. They're laying in the morgue out here in the firehouse. The chairman of the board wants you to come on out and help him with what we're going to say to the press relative to this crash. And in addition to that, Andy's 4 sons, all single, aged 23 and down, one was still alive, are coming out as well, and we hope you can help them through this situation." So that was sort of a baptism by fire. I still very much remember that. And so, yes, that was one of the early influences that hit me. It was really traumatic because Andy Clark was the rainmaker of the firm, firm of about 4 or 5 people. He was the one who brought in the business, and suddenly he was dead at age 53. So that hit me rather hard. From that point on, I had to hold on to the firm, maintain it, and make sure we continued. So that was one of the big influences that hit me, yes.
Can you describe some of the big disappointments in your career and some of your big successes in your career?
I've really been fortunate. I don't get too many disappointments that really come to mind. To be truthful with you, I was disappointed when I would lose a lawsuit. I tried a number of them in my early years. I was happy when I won, but I don't think those are the kind of disappointments those any lawyer has. So I can't think of major disappointments in the true sense. And I've never been disappointed in fellow lawyers or things of that nature. I suppose the thing that I would be most proud of and happy about was my association with the Northern Kentucky International Airport. As I say, when my partner was killed in January of 1968, the airport board named me as general counsel. I was 34 years of age at that time. And at that particular time, the airport was really challenged. There was one terminal building, very small concourse. You got on planes by walking down what we call the tin finger. And on either side of that tin figure, the planes pulled up. So that was not much. For what it's worth, the airport paid a year $5,000 a year for our representation. But then there were other challenges at the airport besides its lack of facilities. It wanted to grow. Northern Kentucky wanted to grow and wanted to keep the airport. There was tremendous pressure to move the airport over to the Cincinnati side of the river because the movers and shakers of Hamilton County, Cincinnati felt that Cincinnati Airport ought not to be in Northern Kentucky. That was sort of a downer. And so there was constant pressure. As a result of that pressure to move the airport, why the airport board could not issue any debt any longer. They had only issued a couple $1 million of bonds. They could no longer, their bonds were not saleable. This is in the late 60s and early 70s. Because of the threat that if the airlines pulled out, there'd be no way of paying off $10, $20 million worth of bonds. So that was a situation for the airport when I arrived. Well, I talk about success. I was very pleased to be part of the team that worked with the airlines, obtained what we called the use agreement. In 1972, we finalized it, in which the airlines agreed that if they moved, they would nevertheless continue to pay the debt service necessary to pay off the bonds, even though they were landing in Cincinnati. Well, with that, the airport moved ahead and grew and grew and grew as you see it now. I was part of the battle to increase the runway capacity, which incurred a lot of battles with Delhi. But we were successful in growing the airport to what it is. There was excellent management over the years, including our current CEO, Candace McGraw. And so it has grown and it's a fixture in Northern Kentucky. I was general counsel for 50 years. And I think when I think back on what can I brag about, if I care to brag, with my association with the airport over those 50 years.
Okay. All right. Wanted to also talk a little bit about throughout your career, any kind of keys, indicators, or any kind of things you can identify that helped you become proficient in the practice that you were eventually working in.
Well, lawyers must work hard and be attentive to their craft, so to speak. The old statement that the law is a jealous mistress, and if you don't pay attention to it, you're going to get slapped in the face, and that's very, very true. But the other thing that really was helpful to me, and I think it's really something that new lawyers should think about, and that is the importance of mentoring. Now, the lawyers that graduate and go with a law firm automatically should and usually do have mentors right there in the law firm. They can go to and say, I got this situation and I don't know what to do, or can you give me some ideas? For the first young folks who start their practice by themselves, or perhaps 2 or 3 of them come out of law school and start together, it's important that they identify one or more lawyers in the community, mature lawyers, who they can talk to, bounce something off of, and ask for their wisdom, basically mentoring. I don't know how many times lawyers have come to me and presented a problem, and they're struggling with, common law research and whatever. And my first question is, well, did you look at the statutes? I think there's a statute right on that point. And all of a sudden their light goes on and off they go. So I think mentoring is one of the most important things that comes to mind when I think about how do you become proficient? And that is by getting the assistance of mature lawyers. I never found a lawyer, as I was growing up, I guess, in the law practice, who refused to talk about whatever I asked. They always helped. They didn't try to take my client away. They gave me advice. I started out as a law clerk when I was still in law school. The lawyer named Stuart Wegner, W-E-G-E-N-E-R. We were on Court Street across from the courthouse. He hired me for a period of time as a clerk. I was certainly helpful. John Corman, another name that's known to the lawyers who are now 60 or over, was a mentor and helped me out extensively. And those are that's what I think is important as you begin to become proficient.
All right. I'll switch over a little bit and talk a little bit about business development, which is an important topic for everyone, and wanted to get your ideas on that. I know originally, I think when you had started practicing, and there was, I'm just going to throw out some numbers, there was 30 lawyers in Northern Kentucky. I think you've always said that the attorney said, that's fine if you're going to come here and practice, but I don't know where you're going to find any business. So,
Well, what you're relating to, as I say, I joined the law firm in September 1958. And in December, remember, it was the Kenton County Bar Association. Northern Kentucky Bar did not exist. Campbell County had their own, Kenton their own, and Boone County only had about 4 lawyers, so they didn't have any association. And I went to the December Christmas party. There were about 53 lawyers there, which is just about the entire Kenton County Bar. And some of them had to be driven home that night. There were no women there. It was only a few years later that Portia Schaefer started as the only woman in Kenton County to practice law. And so that was my experience, my introduction to the Bar Association. Maybe I missed your question there.
I was just seeing how you managed with no business. They indicated that it was pretty well saturated there.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. Well, a number of lawyers came up, shook my hand, introduced themselves, and then pointed out that certainly glad to see you, but I don't know how you're gonna make a living. There isn't enough work here for the ones that we got now. Well, that was a challenge. It was an interesting comment. What I found was the way to get business is to get yourself out and become known as a lawyer. Not particularly known for your skills, because you don't have an opportunity to present those, but just the fact that you're a lawyer. So I was active and encouraged to become active in the Junior Chamber of Commerce, which was referenced before. And I got onto a number of boards and did a lot of charity work, doing some pro bono work for various organizations, some of which became clients over time. For example, the Convention and Visitors Commission, as well as the Convention Center, clients of our office. When they were trying to start those entities, why I was helpful in getting them organized, trying to get them created and whatever. That was all pro bono work for the benefit of the community. And as years passed later on, why they decided, well, yeah, we should probably hire him. And that was a way of developing business. Another source of business is your existing clients. And I had a few of those who did, in fact, refer things to me. One of the biggest referrals that I ever had was when I represented Fess Parker. For those of you who are old enough, he was one that played Daniel Boone and the other
Davy Crockett.
Davy Crockett, right. And he was going to install a theme park in Northern Kentucky near Walton, something like Kings Island, only the theme was going to be more the Davy Crockett type of thing. And a client of mine became aware of this, recommended to Best that he contact me, who he never would have known existed. And that grew into the fact that I represented him all the while we put together a land package, 1,500 acres, and attempt to get that theme park off. Part of that, I visited his home. He flew me up the coast in his single engine airplane from the 20th Century Fox up to his home in Santa Barbara. So that was something that exemplifies how you got a referral from somebody else, knew you were a lawyer and knew your work and referred. So your existing clients, and I think this is generally considered textbook, are a great source of business. And that's probably my best example of one that really was interesting.
How about any advertising?
Well, when I started to practice, you were not permitted to advertise, period. I mean, that was it. Of course, we didn't have television and we didn't have the various social media or whatever, but lawyers were not supposed to advertise, nor were doctors. And so at that time, that was the rule. Ultimately, as everyone listening knows, lawyers can now advertise provided that they follow the various and sundry rules that the court has set down for lawyers. But that's the situation on advertising. It's a bit tricky. You have to be sure you dot the I's and cross the T's when you're putting together your advertisement. But that is a change from how it was when I began.
All right. We talked a little bit about community service, but wanted to get your thoughts on community service for members of our profession, and then also some of the community service that you've done throughout your career.
Well, you know, as lawyers, we're rather well-educated individuals, not bragging about our profession, but that's just the way it is. Therefore, we have the ability to give and to provide services and help and just wisdom and consultation to the community and to those entities that are attempting to start up and whatever. So I see it as a responsibility on the part of a lawyer, an educated person, to actually sit on boards to help out charitable organizations, civic organizations, participate. Yes, I think that's an obligation we have as an educated professional person. And that's the way I feel about it. And I've tried to follow that. I have served on many different boards. I spent 9 years on the Kentucky Independent Health District Board and 12 years on the University of Cincinnati Foundation Board. I'm now in my 6th year as a trustee at Thomas More University. I've served on the BAWAC board, Facility for Special Needs Persons in Boone. I was on the original Riverside Board of Directors, ultimately resolving in Riverside Good Counsel. And I served on the initial board, and I was the first chairman of North Keys Board. Those are different things that I have done in carrying out what I view as the responsibility of a lawyer to give to the community in which he works.
Okay. All right. Switching gears over to some professional responsibility. What can you identify some of the more risky areas with regard to the areas of practice that you've seen?
Well, the insurance company will tell you that the worst is the statute of limitations. More lawyers miss that than other types of sins. And that probably is something that, as a young lawyer, truthfully, I never heard the word statute of limitations when I was in law school. But, you know, it plays an important part. So I think from a lawyer's point of view, that's one of the big things that can get you into trouble. The other is, another thing is I have seen this happen whereby a lawyer will undertake to represent someone, maybe even accept a fee, and then sort of not do anything. Eventually the client is trying to reach the lawyer and complaining, and eventually they go to the bar association. I think that is another area that is a manhole for lawyers as far as things to watch out for or avoid. The other, of course, is conflict of interest. Most conflicts are obvious, but some are rather subtle. And so therefore, it's important to get a feeling that it's not just whether you have an actual conflict of interest, it's whether there is an appearance of conflict of interest. And I think in many instances, there are violations of that. The lawyer is embarrassed, perhaps has to back out. But I think those are areas of pitfalls that I have seen.
In our profession today, do you think, as far as civility between lawyers, do you think it's on the rise or on the decline?
Well, we've talked about civility for years. it comes and goes. But I do not think that we are in a decline at all in civility. There are individuals, lawyers who perhaps have been combatants in court proceedings, and therefore they sort of go at it. But in general, I have not experienced any incivility toward me. Certainly, I don't do it toward other people. I do not think it's on the decline. I've dealt with many lawyers over the years, and I've never had a feeling of incivility. There are one or two or three lawyers in our acquaintance, I suppose, that you would raise questions as to how they act, etc. They're generally known pretty quickly in the bar association, and in some instances they end up disbarred. But I do not think civility is on decline. No.
In that same vein, what are your thoughts on sort of balancing your zealous representation versus cooperation when dealing with another attorney?
Well, that's a fine line, and one that you could hardly see sometimes. You can hurt your client if you are too hard-headed. Many times it can happen that in the heat of the battle, so to speak, whether it's in court, but mostly in negotiation or discussion, you can get involved in the battle itself and forget what you're really trying to accomplish. And if you are too antagonistic, you can aggravate the opposing counsel, whether he shows it or she shows it or not, to the point where something that you could have worked out could have been compromised. Doesn't go that way because you were acting improperly and you aggravated people. You hurt your client that way. And so you have to make an effort to balance that. The best way, one way, is don't raise your voice very often. But it's a feel matter when you feel that you are taking this thing on personally. It's your fight, not your client's fight. And at that point, you've stepped over the line. So those are just my thoughts. There are no black and white answers to what your question is.
Okay. Now, again, looking back at your practice throughout the years, what do you see as your biggest challenge that you had?
The biggest challenge that I had has always been, as you heard, the senior partner was killed very quickly after I was with the firm. That was in '67 when he was killed. It's been a challenge to maintain the business aspect of the firm, to balance the budget, so to speak, and it's something to me I've always worried about because we want to pay our employees fairly and still make a living for the lawyers and for the partners. And that's something that I've struggled with over the years. Many times, in not so much recently, but in years past, why my wife would say to me as I was sitting around worrying about it at home, "Well, you're always worrying about that, but everything seems to work out at the end of the year." So I had that. That was probably my biggest challenge as far as operating in the legal field, or operating as a lawyer.
Okay. And how have you managed over the past 60 years, managed your work life and your family life?
Well, sometimes my wife might say I didn't particularly manage it too well because I would work too much. But fortunately, my first wife, God rest her soul, was also a professional person. And she, for 40 years, worked outside the home. So if I got home at 6, quite often I beat her home. In that sense, it balanced out. It was a burden on her when the kids were small because I had 3 small sons and she was in charge while I was off to some JC meeting or some Board of Adjustment meeting or city council meeting. So that's been difficult to do. I found, truthfully, that now that we work from home, I've just heard some recent complaints, from the back room, so to speak. That, well, now you sit in front of that computer all the time. You get up out of your chair, you go work on the computer and sit back down, you think about it, you don't talk to anybody. So from one point of view, I suppose working from home sort of creates more difficult time because you don't walk away from it. It's right there in your house. I just try now, of course, I don't have too much difficulty because I'm not attempting to carry a full lawyer's load. I do minimal amount of practice, but you have to remember your family. I remember being told by my middle child, telling me one night, well, I thought that's what all lawyers did. They came home, they sat in their chair and they read legal books. Well, I heard that a couple of times as I was raising my family, but it's just a matter of effort. When you begin your practice, it takes more, it's not a 40-hour-a-week job. If you're by yourself, you gotta work like heck to make a living. If you're with a firm, particularly the larger firm, with due respect to those who are listening, it's not a 40-hour-a-week job either. You're given an assigned billable amount of hours you're supposed to produce. And if you analyze it out, know how much time you spend doing things other than practice, it would really take 6 full days to get that accomplished. So it's a constant battle. I've been lucky enough to have lived this long and stayed married to my first wife until she died for 56 years. And hopefully I can stay with the next one for a longer time too.
All righty. Now, outside of the practice of law, what do you see as some of your biggest successes or your sources of satisfaction outside the practice of law?
Well, I enjoyed those various charitable boards and all that I mentioned before. But one of the things that makes my life present now, and it's been a joy for the last almost nearly 20 years, I was the lawyer for R.C. Durr, a name that's familiar to many, many people who are probably listening. He is well known as a philanthropist, contractor, whatever. And I established the R.C. Durr Foundation for a private foundation. And he was, of course, the operator, CEO, or whatever. I was one of 3 board members at that time, but we didn't participate as board members too much. Mr. Durr made his decisions. And as he was in his declining years, I think about a year before he died, he came to me and said, I don't want you to have to worry about that foundation. You got enough to take care of in settling my estate. I think I ought to try to get that foundation wound up, distribute out the money so you don't have to bother. And I said to him, well, RC, that foundation can go on long after you're gone and do a great amount of benefit in our community. Long after, just like you've done, it can continue. And he said, well, who's going to run it? I said, well, I'll run it. First time I ever saw tears in that man's eyes in 40 years, but he said, great. As a result, he decided to put his residuary estate into the foundation after he made some specific requests. The foundation was not created, but continued then after he died in 2007. The work we've done on the foundation has been really rewarding, and we're now able to contribute anywhere between $3 and $4 million a year into the Northern Kentucky community, the charitable community, the nonprofits, and in some cases helping out cities and counties as well. The foundation, we concentrate primarily on 12 Northern Kentucky counties, which Kenton, Campbell, and Boone are, of course, the most populous. But in doing that work, that's probably one of the most rewarding things, as well as the thing I would be most proud of outside of the practice of law.
Okay. My last 2 questions are just to make, if you could tell us something interesting about yourself that most people might not know, and then any advice for the next generation of lawyers.
Well, I am a rather shy person, but in addition, I hate to lose, which some people may find surprising. I was in law school and arguing with a teacher. You know, we had Socratic method, and the teacher, Stevenson at that time, it was a trust course. He says, "You know, Ziegler, you never give up," and so that is something that many people perhaps don't know about me. Uh, Beyond that, I don't know if there's anything spectacular apart from what I mentioned. You know, the fact that I had myriad of jobs. In fact, I was a bartender and waiter for 9 years. Those are things in my background that generally were not known to folks, but they were all mentioned earlier in our discussion. So I don't.
How about your advice to any new lawyers or the next generation of lawyers if you had to pass on some advice?
Well, the mentoring part is probably the most important. If you're not with a firm where you've got folks that can help you, find yourself mentors, relate with your fellow lawyers so that you can ask things and you don't stumble into pitfalls that anybody with a few years practice was known to avoid. That's probably one of the most important things. The other is you've got to work, you've got to be attentive to the law practice. You can't decide to do something on the side. It's a jealous mistress, as I said, and you got to really apply yourself to it. And those are the things I would talk to a young lawyer about.
Okay. Rob, I'll kick it back to you. I don't know if we're gonna do any Q&A there or.
I have a couple questions. One, as you think back about your peers, some of whom may not be with us any longer, can you identify for us a couple of other, and I know if we talked about all the lawyers you respected in the community, we'd be here all afternoon, but if you could identify a couple and why you respected them and why you thought they were legends.
Well, I respected John J. O'Hara. I knew him as a young person. My family attended St. Agnes Church, and J. O'Hara was a member there. And he's a few years older than me. And he was part of the effort to clean up Kenton County and get rid of the gambling, the prostitution, and whatever. And he was part of that group. So was my partner, Andy Clark, and a judge named Melvin Stubbs, who was on our circuit court bench. And they did everything they could, sometimes being knocked down and losing elections. Ultimately, they worked hard, and the circuit judge, Judge Stubbs, was elected, and Jay was elected. And the element in Kenton County, at least, that we deemed undesirable left town, so to speak. And that was something that I really admired. So that's one that comes to mind particularly. Beyond that, I dealt with a John Corman, who was well respected, very moral person, and very modest, but in addition, very ethical. And I admired him very much. He was one of my mentors, so to speak. He gave me a little work to do, like writing briefs. You didn't have law clerks and paralegals, whatever. If a sole practitioner needed something like a brief done, he'd try to find somebody to write it for him. And I did that. That's another lawyer that I viewed as a mentor and very impressed by. So those are some of them that I can recall that come to mind.
You know, in looking at your achievements and leadership through the years, a great deal of it is connected with your faith. And I was hoping, I guess on the Legends program, no topics are off limits: politics, religion, fair game. So it would be wonderful to hear your comment on the role your faith played in this success story.
Maybe I'm missing the question, Rob.
Well, the role that your faith has played in your career. You know, being a lawyer has its own unique sets of challenges and How did was faith something that got you through? Was it how did you view your faith as it related to your practice?
Okay, my faith is well, my wife says I'm a dyed-in-the-wool Catholic, and have been since birth. I'm I'm a regular Sunday attender, and at church I was served on the school board, as you mentioned one time. But no, I always try to look at the client, no matter who they are, as they are a creation of God. In other words, whether they're black, brown, not nice, or whatever, you have to look beyond that and recognize there's a child of God just like the rest of us, and deal with people with that in mind rather than with some peculiar characteristics they have or whatever. And that's the way I tend to look at everybody I relate to, no matter how obnoxious they may seem or whatever. That doesn't make any difference. Underneath, there's always some good there, and I look for that. And I think I picked that up through my religion, through my faith.
That's wonderful. Well, as we wrap up today, on behalf of the NKBA, I want to thank both Will and Rob again for your service to the profession, your service to the region. Please join us for our upcoming Legends programs. We appreciate the support of all the attendees. It's the second Wednesday of each month for the duration of this calendar year. Next month, and I believe the date is April 14th, we're going to be interviewing Stephanie Dietz. She's a legendary Northern Kentucky domestic relations lawyer, and now she leads her own firm, Dietz Family Law. And part of the focus of the program is to make sure that we interview diverse members of the profession with different practice group focus and different backgrounds, and that way we can present a wide range of messages as we build on the series, and we hope it'll continue into 2022 as well. Julie Jones is going to be sending out CLE information to our live attendees today. Please keep in mind that we need your input at the NKBA. Contact us with your program recommendations and any other suggestions you may have. Thanks again for joining us, and everybody have a terrific day.